Hello and welcome to Can Journalism Survive AI? We will have all the answers in the next 50 minutes. I am Courtney Radsch. I'm the director of the Center for Journalism and Liberty at Open Markets Institute, which is a political economy think tank, where we are focused on the political sustainability of journalism in the digital age. And of course, that now means AI. And we have this incredible panel up here. You have the bios in your book, and we're gonna just jump right into the conversation. So first, let's do a little bit of level setting. AI is here, there's no turning back. Journalism is an essential core function of democracy. It's critical in authoritarian contexts, and it is an essential part of the foundational data sets used to develop and train AI. So we actually know that journalism comprises about half of the top 10 sites in the training data of a Google data set that's used to train some of the most popular LLMs. It accounts for nearly half of the top 25 most represented sites in the colossal clean crawl corpus, which is a really important training set. The news and media category is the third most prevalent source of data. The Los Angeles Times, which relies on subscriptions for its business model, is a significant source in there. They recently laid off 200 people. So as we think about journalism and the future of AI, we have to think about the political economy, but also what is the role of journalism when we have chatbots that can create content, answer questions? So we're gonna delve into these questions, but before we do, Meredith, can you just level set us? What is new about generative AI? We know that AI has been around for a while, but just give us a sense of what are we talking about now that's a little bit different from before?
Sure, thanks Courtney. Exciting to be here with all of you today. So what's happening with generative AI is exactly the same as what's happening in other machine learning systems, right? So AI is a pretty broad field and has different subfields. We've got machine learning, we've got neural nets, we've got natural language generation, natural language processing, expert systems. But machine learning is the one that's most popular right now. And so generally when people say AI right now, they mean machine learning, right? So what happens when we make a machine learning system? Well, we take a whole bunch of data and we dump it into the computer. And we say, computer, make a model. Computer says, okay, it makes a model, and the model shows the mathematical patterns in the data. And then we can use that model to do all kinds of cool things like make decisions or make predictions or generate new text or images or audio or video, right? So what a generative AI system is doing when it's generating, say, new text is it's doing something called next token prediction. Every word is a token, and it's predicting what is statistically the most likely next word in a sequence. So it's not thinking, it's not trying to communicate anything about the world, it's not trying to make sense in the way that a human being would, it's just predicting what is the statistically most likely next token, which is really cool, but is not transformative in the way that people usually expect.
But I would say one of the things that is transformative is the ability to mass produce content. Text, images, videos. How many of you in the room have experimented with ChatGPT or another chatbot to create something? All right, there's a lot of hands up in this room right now. You know, what's really interesting, I think, about this is that experts are estimating up to 90% of the internet could be comprised of synthetic media by 2026. So in this sense, it seems like journalism could be really important because it's created by humans, it's new content. There's this thing in large language models called model collapse. If you're trained on too much synthetic data, it will degrade the model and lead to more hallucinations and poor quality outputs. So it seems to me that journalism should be, a really important input, and yet we're seeing more and more layoffs in newsrooms around the world. A lot of, several news organizations that have been caught generating content from these chatbots, and lots of it is inaccurate, leading to disinformation and these hallucinations. And we know that more than half of 1,100 publishers who were surveyed requested that AI web crawlers stop scanning their sites. And though compliance with this is voluntary, we do know that, for example, last year, ChatGPT and Bing had to stop a partnership because they were taking content from behind paywalls. So, Julia, you recently started a new news outlet. How are you thinking about the sustainability and role of journalism in this new era?
Thank you, and it's great to be here. Thank you all. Yeah, I've just started a new newsroom called Proof News, and sort of the hypothesis I have about it is that we're in this world where there's lower and lower costs to creating sort of garbagey content, and a lot of, especially when you talk about non-paywalled media, right? So what's happening is a lot of media, in order to try to keep themselves alive, are going behind paywalls, but most people are really accessing free media, and in the free media space, we're getting overrun. We were already kind of overrun with kind of very low quality content, and then AI supercharges that. And so the idea of Proof is that we as journalists need to show the audience why we're different from that content. And so Proof's all about showing how we got to our answer. We have an ingredients label for each story that basically says, like, what was our hypothesis? What were we thinking was true? What did we find? What are the limitations of our findings? And so it's an attempt to sort of try to show the quality so that a reader doesn't have to just rely on the brand name of, like, oh, I think such and such news outlet is a good one, because what we're seeing is a lot of news brands that have historical meaning have been hollowed out by their new owners and are generating AI content or whatever, so you can't always trust the brand name like you used to. So I think we have to show our work within the story itself.
And Dhruv, you've kind of talked about that as well as an investigative data journalist, about the importance of transparency for building trust with audiences. And that as we move more into the algorithmic era, that you need to explain more. Can you talk a bit about that and how you see the link between kind of the explanation, transparency, and trust that is essential in journalism?
Yeah, I mean, I think in an information ecosystem that's sort of overrun by high volumes of low quality information, you really, like Julia said, you really need to kind of show your work and build kind of authority in the stuff that you're reporting. And I think largely the way that I've done this in the past has been by writing a long, detailed methodology that explains every finding in the nut graph of a story. But what I'm finding now is that it's not enough just to show your work, but you really need to foreground your work, right? You need to package your work in a way where people are actually interested in reading about how you got a story or how you analyzed the data. And it's not enough, right, just to write 40,000 words about a regression that you ran or some machine learning model that you tested. You really need to kind of get on TikTok or social media and do a post that's like, hey, this is how I landed this story. This is what worked. This is what didn't work, and be really upfront about the entire process.
Meredith, you want to weigh in here?
So I agree with Dhruv. I think that is an essential component of this kind of reporting, and one of the reasons I think for that is a literary reason. So writing about technology is really hard because it's difficult to explain complex technical topics in plain language, but it's also hard because watching somebody code is boring. Right? And one of the things that we love in good journalism, in good nonfiction writing, is we like characters moving around and doing things and growing and learning. And so if you've ever watched somebody play a video game, how it's really tedious. We can't do that when we're reporting. So one of the things that reporters can do is we can put ourselves into the story and we can show our own journey of learning about the thing. And that is it's a useful literary device that makes it more interesting for readers.
But arguably, large language models can now spit out these stories. And Julia, you've kind of said that maybe the value add of journalism isn't so much the storytelling anymore because that's so easy to replicate. how do you see this dynamic?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, I do want to just say, Meredith, that there's an extremely thriving genre of people who watch people play video games. It's like a very big sector of YouTube. So I think you might be wrong about how exciting that is. But I also do want to say that, like, I want to push back a little bit on the story thing, because I actually think we're in a world right now where we're in a flood of stories. Every one of you on your social media feed has thousands of stories. The idea that like narratives are scarce is something that journalists used to believe, that we were the ones who brought you these great narratives. Now we're drowning in narratives. And so I actually think journalism needs to think a little bit of pivoting its role from this idea of narrative first to really much more about analysis. What people are looking for is which one of these freaking stories in my feed is actually true or representative of the truth.
And that's the perfect segue, because you just recently did an investigation into how 12 different AI systems provided election-related information. And if I recall from the reporting, it was really about reporting the analysis and, not to give away the main point, but they did very poorly. So is that the type of thing you're talking about?
Yeah, I think the first sort of big investigation for my newsroom proof was about how well do AI models perform when you ask them pretty basic information about voting in the United States. So like, where is my local polling place, or am I eligible, or what's the registration deadline? For those of you in Europe who don't understand what I'm talking about, we try to make voting really hard in the US, so there's a lot of rules, and it's very confusing. What I wanted to know was, like, anecdotally, you would hear stories like, oh, generative AI is bad at this kind of question, or it gave me the wrong answer, but I wanted a little more systematic approach. So I actually brought 25 election officials from across the US to sit in a room and with computer scientists, including Meredith and Dhruv, who were there, to test the models and see if they gave accurate results, and they did not. So the leading 5 AI models were inaccurate more than 50% of the time, and actually Google Gemini was the worst with like more than 70% inaccuracy. So there's a huge range of performance in these models, and that is what I wanted to put. So I wanted to contextualize this thing, that you might see a little story here or there in your feed about it gave me this wrong answer or that wrong answer, but then when you have a bunch of experts in the room and you actually have a systematic test of 130 queries, then we could say a little bit more definitively that A, most of them performed badly, and B, these particular ones did worse than these other ones. Because I think another thing is, we always talk about AI as one giant thing, and they're actually multiple products, and they have different range of performance on different types of questions.
Dhruv, do you want to weigh in quickly before we pick up on that point?
Yeah, I just wanted to kind of gently push back against the idea that story isn't important here, because, when I write a story and then write the accompanying methodology, nobody reads the methodology. Like 0 people read it. And I feel like there's a sort of balance that you have to strike, where it seems like people really do care about the story, like the inside story of how you got a scoop. Like, I'll give you an example. Last month, we published a story on Wired about a data broker that had tracked the cell phones of visitors to Jeffrey Epstein's island. And we did an analysis on that data to kind of figure out where in the United States these people came from. And because of the nature of the story, we assumed that people were going to think the data was fabricated. So when we put out the story, instead of doing a long methodology about how we found the data, we actually did a TikTok video where I just got on TikTok and I walked through exactly how we found the data. And that was viewed 1 million times, which is, I've never had my face seen by 1 million people, but like.
And you said that the TikTok video was viewed more times than the story.
Exactly, yeah. It got more engagement than the story itself.
I'm not sure what that means for the future of journalism, though, right? Because ultimately the journalistic product maybe got less attention. Interesting. But I want to pick up on this really important, I think, thing that you coming out of what Julia said, which is there's a fundamental difference about today's AI systems and the way that they've been integrated into search, for example. So search has typically been about searching for information, but now it's also about creating information. So it's, kind of emerging these two typically separate, the creative production of information versus the search for accurate, actual, reliable information. And Meredith, you wrote a pioneering book in 2018 called Artificial Unintelligence, where you talked about some of the inherent bias and talk to us a little bit about why do we need to be really concerned but also discerning about how we're thinking about these complicated AI systems and the way that they're built and the biases that they perpetuate.
Well, one of the things that I find really useful in approaching AI systems is an idea that comes from Ruha Benjamin's book, Race After Technology. And this is the idea that automated systems, AI systems, discriminate by default. Right? So for a very long time, there's been this idea that AI is somehow objective or neutral or unbiased, which is not at all true. Right? If you think about how machine learning systems are made, you think about, okay, all of this data is going into the computer about the world as it is. Well, we do not live in a perfect world, right? All of the biases and, all the structural discrimination of the world as it exists now is represented in the data we're using to train AI systems. And so the mathematical patterns that the AI learns are patterns of discrimination and bias. So for example, with generative AI, if you look at a couple of the, really, if you look at every investigation of generative AI, you find that it works very badly and that it is deeply discriminatory. Right, so one of the stories that I really like is something that came out from Bloomberg recently, where they fed resumes into ChatGPT and said, okay, rank these resumes. Well, then the ChatGPT discriminated based on people's names, and when you looked at the race and gender breakdown, it was biased in, in pretty familiar ways. Bloomberg also did an investigation into Stable Diffusion, which is an image generating AI, and found that in the world of Stable Diffusion, if you put in CEO, you get an image of a white man. If you put in the prompt dishwasher, you get a person of color, right? So these models do not have nuance. They do not pay attention to diversity. They just reproduce inequality. And I don't think that gets us toward a better world.
However, there has been a growing awareness of the bias and discriminatory nature of the data that is used to build and train these models. And so you've got, for example, Elon Musk creating Grok, his chatbot that is specifically designed to not be woke, to have a specific political leaning. And then you've got Google with Gemini, where it seems like its attempt to address those biases led to things like pictures of black Nazis, multicultural founding fathers of the US who are all white. So what are the risks of trying to correct for bias in these systems that are combining kind of the creation of content with the search for factual information? Because as we know, the founding fathers were all white, and as far as we know, there were no black Nazis. Do you have thoughts? Because I think your work, the algorithmic decision making is a little bit different, but now we've melded these two systems. What do you think some of the risks we should be thinking about, especially as journalists are using these content generators in their work? Julia?
Well, I think it's a dumb idea to use generative AI in search. That's period.
Excellent. Julia?
I mean, that's kind of what I was going to say. But I think you're touching on a question that is really a live question in the field of fairness and algorithms, which is basically, how do you address these issues? Do you try to basically adjust these systems in some crude way to like overcome the biases of the training data? Do you try to debias the training data itself or use better data to train? But I think that those questions are like circling around the edges of the real question, which is, what are we actually thinking these models do? I want to say that the idea that they create, the way that you described it, right? They create like a plausible next token, the next word, etc. They are not designed for accuracy. They are explicitly have warnings like nothing in this answer is accurate. So the question I have is, why do we call it artificial intelligence? Like, if I went out and marketed a product called intelligence and then everything that it said was likely untrue, I feel like we have to question that assumption entirely as part of the answer to that question, because it may not be about biasing, debiasing. It may be more that we need to understand that these systems are just weirdo, I like to call them poetry bots. They're really good at poetry. If you want a poem, they will make you a nice limerick or a haiku, whatever you want, a sonnet. And so maybe we need to rethink what they are for.
And yet, nonetheless, we have generative search. We have, pretty much every major search platform is integrating generative AI into its search. And that's where you could see journalism, I think, becoming more valuable. And so I kind of want to delve into that, because we've got, large language models are static. They're trained on, billions of parameters. But then to make these results more relevant, more timely, more accurate to a given search query through, retrieval augmented generation, RAG, or grounding, they can plug into APIs, they can scrape news content particularly, or you see like with Google's deal with Reddit to try to get that more updated information. Do you think that this is where journalism could have particular value for these systems? Does that help address some of the key problems? Do you think we should still not have generative search, or should we be demanding as journalists, as news publishers, that to make these products better and more accurate, you need this news, and so you should pay for it. It has value. Dhruv?
Well, I think that these generative AI models can't really survive without more journalism, right? Without up-to-date news about the world. They rely on that information to be kind of timely and accurate, or to try to be timely and accurate. So, I mean, I don't remember what your question was here.
Well, I mean, so journalism is really important. What do you guys think? Should we be thinking about, the value of journalism in generative search?
I mean, I think what I'm really worried about is this, there's an implicit assumption in that like journalism's role is to make their products more accurate, and that is not our role. Like, our role is to be watchdogs on power, and I think it's actually, thank you, I think it's actually really harmful that they are scraping all of journalism's content, basically taking, I think the deal they made with AP, right, for 150 years of the archive for what I think are single-digit millions of dollars, is, I'm worried that this turns us into just unpaid workers for the most profitable companies in the world, and I think that is unfair.
Yeah, I mean, the economics of this are really important to talk about. I think that the news bargaining codes, I think, are something we should definitely bring up, because tech companies are profiting from journalism. It used to be that media organizations would sell their own ads and then get money and thrive. And then all of that ad money started going to the tech platforms, and then like a little dribble came out to media organizations. And yes, the media industry has fallen apart because of a lack of money. Like, yes, that has happened. So we need to think about what's happening with generative AI and not make those same mistakes. Right? So, for example, I am the author of several books. When you buy one of my books, I get a teeny tiny bit of money, right? I wish it were bigger, but it's teeny tiny. So that is a transaction that happens in the world. It is, one of the economic things that allows people to make a living as a writer. But my book was used without my consent to train a generative AI system. Right? I found it in a data set called Books 2. So Books 2, Books 3, and the Common Crawl are like some of the most popular data sets that are used by all of these generative AI companies. And so my book was taken without my permission. All of the other books in that data set, like major copyright violations, used to train generative AI, and I don't see any of the teeny tiny bits of money from that. And that happened to every writer, every artist whose work was stolen. That's not good for the world.
And yet they're claiming fair use. And I think
It's not fair use.
Agree. I think one of the things, and I want to unpack a couple things you mentioned. You mentioned the shift in digital advertising. But remember, this wasn't just about the rise of Craigslist and online advertising. It was about the fact that a couple of companies owned the ad exchanges, the ad buying and selling platforms, and were able to charge monopoly rents, and it's a very opaque process. So it wasn't just that they did something better and the journalism couldn't keep up, right? It was fundamentally changed the market and the business structure, and they were given unprecedented exemptions from most laws and unprecedented protections, right? I mean, Julia, you were a publisher. You are responsible for the content that your reporters and news publication produces. Platforms are not because of Section 230. How does this, dynamic play out? It just seems like we've given them these, unfettered rights and privileges while not holding them accountable for the massive theft of intellectual property.
I mean, yes, absolutely. I think one thing that's, most journalists who are here will know is that one of the biggest costs and stresses of running a newsroom is getting media liability insurance, having lawyers on hand to make sure that you are protected, because when your job is to challenge power, power will come after you. And a lot of times that looks like a legal threat or a lawsuit. And so journalists spend a huge amount of time making sure that every word we write is accurate and defensible, and that we could stand in court and stand behind it. And then we are literally competing with these companies that have been given immunity from liability, so they are not liable for any information on their platforms. I will say AI gives me some hope in a weird way, because these companies are in court right now, right? The New York Times is suing OpenAI, saying basically that this is copyright theft, and OpenAI is saying, oh, it's fair use, which means like basically we're allowed to use basically like 10% of content, and that's like okay, but it's really, most of it is not yours, right? So to me, that's actually a really wonderful opening, because if they're saying it's not, they didn't steal it, then they have to own the fact that they wrote it, and then for the first time ever, are they going to be liable for their content? Because they have never had to stand behind anything before. They have let all this fake news run rampant over their platforms. Because to be clear, it's the same companies, right? The social media, like big tech giants are also the AI giants, and there's not really a lot of room for others because it's such an expensive operation.
Right, so you've got basically the same big tech giants that are, dominating the AI, and despite this kind of perception of innovation, you've actually got, significant ownership or partnership, deals between these AI companies, and you can kind of then treat the potential costs of IP violations as a cost of doing business, right? I mean, I think Microsoft said that it would cover the legal fees of anyone who was sued from generated AI content. But one of the things I really found interesting about the New York Times lawsuit against OpenAI and Microsoft is that they're also calling for the destruction of the model. And there is precedence in the Federal Trade Commission, the FTC in the US, has started not only fining companies that use ill-gotten data, but also requiring algorithmic disengorgement, which is my new favorite term. basically they have to destroy the algorithms that were created from that ill-gotten data. It seems to me that's the same thing we're asking for these companies. Do you think that's the right approach? Do you think it's possible that we would even see that type of result, or do you think there's so much power that they wouldn't possibly impose that sort of?
I feel like it's, I love the term, although it gives me some Viagra feelings that are confusing, but anyways, but I do think that, there's a lot of focus that I feel like that is incorrect around the algorithms, because the reality is that a lot of the models that people talk about, many of them are open source or inspectable. Some of them are not, but there are plenty that are, and they don't perform any differently. They are stealing the same content, right? So sometimes I feel like the focus on models is actually a distraction, because the real truth of it is about the training data that they stole and the fact that no one else can really process that amount of data. That means that's the big barrier to entry, right? Is like this huge corpus that you need to train a model. Anyone can basically use these models.
And the expense of doing so. It was estimated that it cost $100 million to create GPT-3, and $1 million a day to run. But okay, I want to also talk about the people, right? We're here, we're all journalists, and Drew, you're a journalist. You're out there on the front lines. Meanwhile, the news industry is struggling for viability. How are you thinking about the future of journalism, human journalism, and the type of work that you've been doing?
Well, in the short term, I'm worried about especially sort of private equity-run newsrooms and how management there will sort of see these perceived productivity benefits from generative AI and kind of force unreasonable extra work on news workers, right? Like, that's my first concern kind of now, having worked in several digital newsrooms. Long term, I think, the type of work that we're describing here, and describing like being sort of methodology forward and bulletproof, is expensive work. Even running, like doing the TikTok video I was describing, that requires a social media team, and it requires a whole bunch of like designers and things. Like, I worry about compensation for the work for the extra work that we have to do to sort of be authoritative sources.
So this is, you mentioned, Meredith, news media bargaining codes. So just, for those who might not be familiar with the term, Australia and Canada have passed laws that essentially make big tech pay for the news they use in search and in social media, because it provides great value, not only to those direct searches, but to the entire experience on the platform. And there are at least a dozen other countries around the world, including the United States and two states in the US that are considering similar laws. The platforms seem very concerned about this. Google is censoring news in California right now. But it seems to me that these news media bargaining codes, although they have been initially developed to focus on search and social media, could also be leveraged for AI. And so you mentioned these and the importance of maybe we have to work collectively to get these to work against these companies. So how are you, do you think that is a direction that we should go? Should we be seeking compensation for the work that shows up in these large language models, for the training? Is there some other way that we should be thinking about it, Meredith?
So I really like a paper that Anya Schifrin wrote recently about what is the value of news to Google. I can't remember how many hundreds of billions. Do you remember how many hundreds?
So it's $13 billion to Google and Facebook.
Yeah, $13 billion that Facebook and Google are making from news media content every year, right? And that money is not going to publishers. Some of that money should be going to, that money should be going to publishers, because that represents a split of 50-50 split based on what they're profiting.
Yeah, exactly. So that study was based on a study done in Switzerland, where they did basically, this half of the room got search results that had news in it. that half of the room had search results that had no news in it. Say you're searching for, you just had a baby formula, what's happening? Don't you want to know if there's a recall? So they actually found that people behave differently, not just if they're searching for news, but on the entire platform. So then they linked that to how much digital advertising revenue is created, and they said that, okay, in most economic analyses, we would split the additional value that's created. So that's how they got to the number. Can we think about doing the same thing for AI, but how could we even figure out, you mentioned your book is in books too. I haven't checked to see if mine is, but I am definitely going to right after this panel. But that's only going to be like a tiny fraction of these billion tokens, et cetera. So how might we think about the value of journalism to AI models?
I mean, that's such a good question. I will say your book is most likely in there because my 2 books are in there. And there's a little way you can look up. It's called the Books 3 database, and it has a little lookup. Anyone who's written a book, you should check because most likely it was stolen and scanned into this AI system. But I think that the one thing that I think is really important about your question is that we should be able to know what data is being used. The only way we know about this Books 3 database being used was that some investigative journalist basically found it and proved that it was used in one of the models, I think Meta's. The other companies haven't actually said whether they're using that model or not, but they probably are, we just don't know. So I think very first thing we need is transparency. Like if they're taking our information and using it to build a product, we should know, and there should be transparency around it.
And transparency would be really helpful too as we talk about AI safety, right? There's this issue around provenance, and I think if we could trace that and require the ability, whether it's for copyright or safety or provenance, that actually solves a lot of these issues. And we've seen how in previous eras of technology regulation, we've actually seen intellectual property, copyright kind of at the forefront. Porn and copyright, right? That's kind of what drives technology these days. So do you think, though, that as you mentioned how expensive journalism is this going to be the solution? You mentioned, Meredith, also that we don't want to become just, doing work for the platforms. So how are we thinking about, where is the value of journalism in this system, and how do we continue to pay the costs of the journalists who need to go into the courtroom or into the jail, where AI can't go?
Well, I think journalists should be paid. I think they should be paid a lot more. That's my personal opinion. So, thank you. Another thing I think we need to think about, though, is this assumption that journalists' jobs are going away, right? This is always the first thing that people say when they talk about AI. They're like, "Oh, AI is going to replace the journalists." Well, if you look at what the generative AI systems are generating, it's really bad journalism, right? You would be fired as a journalist for writing stuff that is inaccurate, that is as boring as the material that the generative AI systems put out, right? So the people who really should be worried about their jobs are computer programmers, right?
Yes.
So the big advance of generative AI systems, like what I think is really the major intellectual achievement of them, is that they turn natural language into code, right? And so coding is going to get much, much easier, and already we see all these layoffs in tech because if you can get the computer to write code, there aren't plagiarism issues in code the same way there are plagiarism issues with journalism. So we really need to be talking about computer programmers as people whose jobs are going to go away.
Yes, and we can do that at another conference. But I will say it's not an assumption that jobs are being replaced. There have literally been thousands of layoffs, including specifically in newsrooms that have adopted new generative AI tools and are replacing journalists. So I just want to, I think it's something we need to worry about across sectors. And Julia, it looked like you wanted to weigh in on this topic as well.
Yeah, I think one thing that is worth noting is that there's definitely a push to try to save money in newsrooms and in every company through generative AI. And what we have seen is that it actually isn't clear yet, I think, whether it saves you money, because what it does is creates bad content that some human then has to edit, especially in a newsroom, because you still are liable for the information that you put out, and so you do need it to be accurate. And so I think there was a CNET was using it, and they said that it took more hours actually for the editors to clean up the copy and make it work. So I would just push back slightly and say, I think it's not yet proven that generative AI even is going to provide productivity gains.
What are you thinking, Dhruv? I mean, we're also seeing that newsrooms are, creating partnerships that aren't just monetary in terms of, with these tech companies, are also, adopting their technologies, figuring out how to better use them, integrate them into the newsroom. Do you think this is, a positive trend because you can do cool new things, or is it dangerous because we're further embedding, these companies into the newsroom and becoming further dependent on their products?
It's a little of both, right? I mean, I think with GPT-4 and some of the data analysis tools that it offers, it really does speed up my workflow in a way that I can audit. Like, it has a code interpreter. When I ask it to run a regression or something, I can ask it to spit out the code, and then I can run it myself and make sure the results are the same. So there are certain values, of course, to this tool. And I think, like, to your point, computer programmers should be worried. And to your point, it's really unclear what the efficiency gains are in terms of, like, generative, like, summarizing a story or something and writing a blog, which is what CNET was trying to do. Because, of course, you have to have the editor come in and spend a bunch of hours fixing something that was, like, it was 90% right, but they had to fix the 10% that was way wrong. So yeah, I think it's a little bit of both, and it's about finding sort of the right and safest application of the tool.
Great. Well, I want to open up to the audience if there's anyone who wants to ask a question. I think that we have a couple of microphones, so I'm going to ask if there is a microphone and somebody has a question. Okay, I see here if we can get a microphone over here. And while the microphone gets to you, just want to ask, so Reddit and Google signed a $60 million deal, and we know that Reddit has a lot of disinformation, misogyny, really low quality content, along with a lot of high quality content. Journalism typically doesn't have as many maybe of those problems. So do you think that's a good benchmark for starting to think about the value of journalism, where we should be starting our negotiations?
No, I think, I honestly think what we should do is a similar analysis like what Anya did with the bargaining codes, where you actually look at the value to like a consumer welfare study, the similar, and work backwards from like the benefits that news provides to the product, and then value it, and then go and decide what that split should be. Because I think starting from the base that the companies have set is a low base.
Agree. All right, we had a question here. Please go ahead.
Hey, thank you for such an insightful panel. I think that what you said about proof news and the quality of analysis is really interesting. Do you think even if we have the highest quality of analysis and the best kind of distribution in social media, highest quality social media efforts, do you really think that that will rise to the top of people's consumption channels? And if not, do you think a lot about structural trade, structural alliances? I know that Proof, for example, is just combined with Cal Matters. What do you think that structural alliances with institutions or other newsrooms play in the future of journalism?
Thank you, that's a good question. I just want to clarify that the company I previously founded, The Markup, merged with Cal Matters, and Proof is my new startup. Have a problem with starting too many companies. But I think your question about how to get to the top of the algorithmic feed is a really important one. And that is something else where the companies have given us no controls, right? Like, I want a dial to adjust my feed. When I was looking at some cheesecake recipes on TikTok, and then my entire TikTok has been cheesecake ever since. And I just want a dial that's like less cheesecake, right? Like, and we don't have that. They don't give us any control. And so this is a problem not just for publishers who are trying to get to the top of the algorithm, but also for consumers. I'm really heartened by the EU Digital Services Act, which this is the first law that gives some measure of control. It basically says the companies have to provide you at least one alternative algorithm. But in my ideal world, and I've written about this in the New York Times opinion page, I think we should actually be allowed to come up with our own algorithms and like put in or adjust it the way we want. And that feels to me like a right that we should all have.
Are there any other questions?
Hello, I would like to discuss about the AI amplified attacks against journalists. When we talk about can journalism survive AI, there's currently a rise of online attacks against journalists, and what kind of solution could we develop to collectively counter these armies of trolls attacks, particularly these years ahead of elections, and also because women journalists and marginalized communities are particularly targeted by these attacks. It has never been so easy to produce false content to discredit journalists. So what can we collectively do against these threats? Thank you.
Well, I might take that one since, Elodie, thanks for the question. We've worked on this for a long time. You know, one of the things is, again, this freedom from obligation and responsibility that the platforms have for harassment that takes place, the lack of remedy. But I think also we have to look at how AI exacerbates that, and that some of the things like the DMCA, the Digital Millennium Copyright Act, which was put in place to address online copyright violations, you know, that was developed very early on. Hashing systems, which are essentially digital fingerprints that are put at the filter level to prevent copyright content from even getting put online. Why aren't we using some of these same techniques and approaches to combat online harassment of journalists? I think also that as we think about the future of journalism, we have to think about the people who want to go into journalism, which is an increasingly dangerous and, you know, uncomfortable profession. You know, does anyone else want to respond to that question on online harassment?
Well, I think it's important to note that the platforms don't really have an incentive to stop harassment because they are profiting from it. You know, harassment is a viral kind of event, and platforms make money off of that, so that's one of the reasons that we don't have better protection for journalists. I mean, that's unconscionable, but it is the case.
And of course, what we're seeing now is the ease of creating synthetic media, videos, images. What is the first thing that's happening? You've got non-consensual synthetic porn being created, or synthetic images, and we know that journalists are among, and political leaders, female political leaders especially, you know, what is it, 90% of deep fakes are of women. So now we're supercharging something that's already been around for, you know, years, and again, with continuing impunity. We are reaching the end of this discussion, so I think, okay, we'll have one very quick question from Guy here in the front, if we have a microphone. Okay. We do not. Here, oh yeah, thank you, Dhruv.
Thank you. So I'm going to show my age and mention a philosopher who lived quite a long time ago, who said that when you look at forces of production, you always also have to look at relations of production. So we say, can journalism survive AI as if it was a technology that was somehow disembodied from relations of production? But of course it's not. And so my question is, if we think of AI under different relations of production, can we change the topic here to say, can journalism thrive with AI in different relations of production, as opposed to survive the existing relations of production?
I mean, that's a great question. That's certainly what we're trying to change at the Center for Journalism and Liberty, but maybe I can ask who wants to grapple with that challenging question? I mean, Julia, you're a publisher. Do you see the ability to change the relationship in terms of the modes of production, or do you feel like you're hostage in this system and you're just having to play by the rules that are already set? Can we envision a different?
I would like to be able to envision a different system. I think right now the problem is that media is weak, and financially, politically, and so our ability to like renegotiate the rules is less than I would like it to be.
Mm-hmm. Meredith, do you want to weigh in on this one?
I think that I am just going to follow after Julia. And actually, I would like her to be one of the people rewriting the rules.
Dhruv? Oh, they took your mic. All right. Yeah, I think also in terms of rethinking that relationship, you know, there are some really important antitrust cases right now in the US and Europe, so that will decide whether one company can own the digital advertising ecosystem and the publishing platforms and AI and cloud services. So it does seem to me that if we use antitrust and competition policy to break up these vertical monopolies, and if we impose the same rules and obligations on tech companies that every other sector is subject to and don't provide special dispensation to, you know, again, like through things like Section 230 or the theft of intellectual property, I think there is hope. However, I think that takes a lot of political will, and there is a bit of that in Europe. You know, we are seeing, but it will depend on how the judiciary decides these cases. And whether they decide to use this very narrow conception of consumer welfare as just about the price you pay, or whether they step back and think about consumer welfare and what that means for a thriving democracy, human rights, and the future of key institutions like journalism. So with that, I think we are at the end of our time. No, we are not. No, yes, we are. No, I can't tell. We can still keep going? No, we are at the end of our time. Sorry. So I want to thank you all. I want to thank our incredible panelists. Thank you to the audience, and we'll see you next time.